Henry Baird, otherwise known as Red, was a 28-year-old World War II veteran living in Humboldt County, California. By June of 1950, he was working as a bakery truck driver and about to go on a date with his girlfriend of 2 months, Barbara Jo Kelley. Barbara was 17 years old, and she worked as a waitress in a local restaurant called the Sweet Shop. But anyone who knew Barbara also knew that she was deeply religious, which is probably why her parents trusted her not to get into any trouble when Red came by to take her to the cinema on the evening of the 18th of June. The movie the couple planned on seeing would almost guarantee that they'd be back quite late at night, but the Kelleys trusted their daughter. But neither of Barbara's parents could have known that that evening, when they said goodbye to Barbara and sent her on her date with Red, would be the last time that they saw either one of them alive again. Red and Barbara went to the cinema as planned, but after that they seemed to just vanish. Neither of them came home that night, and early the next morning, 2 fishermen out on the beach at Table Bluff Beach found the body of a man lying face down in the sand. The man was naked, apart from his socks and shoes, and it was very clear to anyone looking at him that he hadn't died from natural causes. The man had been shot in the head, and the fishermen called the murder into the police. When the investigators got to the scene, they found the man's clothing folded in a neat pile beside his body, but that wasn't all that they found. Beneath the man's clothing was another set of clothes, also neatly folded and placed in a pile and clearly belonging to a woman. The shoes and stockings were missing, and immediately the police began to worry that they would find another body. The investigators were able to identify the man as Red, and when Barbara's parents realised that she was missing, everyone put 2 and 2 together. Judging by the little evidence left at the scene, the authorities believed that someone had attacked the young couple at gunpoint. Whoever their attacker had been had then forced the couple to strip, killed Red, and kidnapped Barbara. The only thing the investigators could do was hold on to the hope that they would find Barbara alive. However, the days turned into weeks and then years, with hope slowly fizzling out. The killer had left nothing behind them, and with no witnesses, the case quickly went cold. It wasn't until a full 13 years later that the investigators were able to name a suspect in the case, and that was only because he decided to come clean himself. Serving a sentence in a California state mental hospital was a man named Gail Patrick Irish. He'd been serving time since 1958 for sexual assault and kidnapping charges that involved a 12-year-old girl in Humboldt. Only now he had a lot more to add to his list of crimes. While at the hospital, Gail claimed to have found religion, and then he made a startling confession to the prison chaplain. Gail claimed to have killed at least 3 people, one of those being a man named Billy Wells Hale. In 1957, Billy had been out on a date with his girlfriend. It was the middle of the night, and they were sitting in Billy's parked car in a lane about 6 miles north of Marysville, California. Gail claimed that he'd walked up to the car, shot the man in the head, and then turned to the woman. Gail said then that he'd tied her up so she couldn't escape and driven her to a different location. He'd taken her about 16 miles away, where he found an empty house, and then he dragged the woman inside. He then threatened her with a razor blade, but the woman was able to escape unharmed when the homeowners unexpectedly showed up and forced Gail to flee the scene. The investigators must have been struck by the similarities between Billy's case and Red's, but they became even more sure that Gail had something to do with them both when Gail confessed to 2 more murders. Gail said that he'd been at Table Bluff Beach during the summer of 1950, and while he was there, he'd killed a young couple. Prison officials immediately contacted the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, who then dispatched investigators to interrogate Gail, and when they got there, they found that Gail's story had started to make a lot of sense. Gail claimed that he'd been out on the beach that night, looking for his next victims, when he spotted a young couple sitting in a car. Gail had then walked up to the car, held the couple at gunpoint, and forced them out of the vehicle. He then forced the pair of them to strip before he'd ordered the man to get on his knees, and then Gail shot him in the back of the head. With the woman now naked and completely defenceless and alone, Gail had then forced her back into the car and started driving. They drove quite a distance, at 2 points heading into the towns of Eureka and Arcata, where the woman could have maybe shouted for help, but Gail said that she'd been frozen with fear and had just sat there instead of trying to escape. They ended up about 35 miles away from the beach, where Gail then pulled over into a logging road and used the large logs as cover to hide what he was about to do. Gail raped the woman, shot her, and then wrapped her body in a blanket before he was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Gail had planned to bury her body, but someone had clearly heard the sounds of Gail's gunshot and was on the way to investigate. Gail could see the headlights of a truck coming closer, and not wanting to be caught, he dumped the woman's body behind a log and drove away before anyone could spot him. Worried that someone would discover her, Gail had returned to the scene 2 months later to try and hide the woman's body, but by then, he said many of the logs had moved and he wasn't able to find the body again. The police were incredibly interested in what Gail had to say, especially when it seemed to be the only real lead they had on the case that was now 13 years old. They flew him out to Humboldt County so that he could revisit the crime scenes and hopefully tell them more, while their counterparts at the hospital tried to find the gun that Gail had been carrying when he'd been arrested. Back in Humboldt County, news about Gail's confession had spread, and wanting to corroborate what they could, the investigators ended up speaking with a well-known local boxer, Oliver Hanurn. Oliver claimed to know Gail, and he said that the both of them had been living and working in the area together during the time of Red's murder. When investigators put Oliver and Gail in the same room, the two men recognised each other, adding a level of legitimacy to Gail's confession and putting him as close to the crime scenes as they could without any more physical evidence to work with. Gail then led investigators to the logging road, which was still in use, but by then, the place where he claimed to have dumped Barbara's body was almost completely overgrown. Many people, including the Georgia-Pacific Woods boss Earl Shipley Company, provided tools to help the investigators search the area, but each time the searchers came back with nothing. A few months later, the police received a call from a family who'd once lived in the area that renewed hope in the investigation. The family claimed that the children had often played on the logs, and one day they'd come home saying they'd found human bones in between them. The children claimed that one of the bones still had a wristwatch around it, and they were able to give the investigators some idea of where they'd seen them. Incredibly, the location the children gave matched the area that Gail had already shown the investigators, so everyone got back to work to try and find Barbara. A quick call to Barbara's family confirmed that she'd left for her date wearing a wristwatch, and then all anybody wanted to do was get to the bottom of the case. And the investigators were certain that Gail was telling the truth. A deputy working on the case later came out and said, "This boy has too much knowledge of the details not to have first-hand information." But unfortunately, the investigation kept hitting dead ends. A hunter told the investigators that in 1962 he'd found a woman's black leather shoe in the exact same location that Gail claimed to have dumped Barbara's body. The hunter hadn't thought anything about it at the time, but as the news spread about the investigation, it jogged his memory and he called the tip in. The tip also went nowhere, and after a 60-person team searched the area and came back empty-handed, the chief criminal deputy, Captain Edward Hulbert, reportedly turned to Gail and said, "You're either afraid to look at what's left, or you're afraid someone is going to hurt you." Gail had allegedly refused to answer the captain and had turned the conversation into another one about religion instead. But the investigators were sure that they had their man. If they couldn't find Barbara, they knew that they could put Gail at the crime scene if they could match the bullets from the gun he'd been arrested with to the bullet found in Red's body. But almost unbelievably, they hit yet another dead end. During that time, Gail had spent serving a sentence in the mental institution. The police had lost the gun they'd confiscated from him on the day of his arrest. This was the last piece of physical evidence that could have proven that Gail was telling the truth, and after all that, the only thing the authorities in Humboldt County could do was send Gail back to the mental hospital he'd originally been serving his sentence in. To this day, they haven't been able to formally link Gail to the case or officially name him as a suspect, as everything comes down to his confession, and that certainly wouldn't stand up in court. The official records of both Red's murder and Barbara's disappearance don't mention anything about Gail, and Barbara is simply listed as missing to this day.